My daughter and her husband emptied my workshop, stacked everything I owned by the curb, and told me I was no longer welcome in the house I'd spent 11 years helping them keep. 3 days later, my son-in-law was leaving his 9th voicemail of the morning, and my daughter was crying into the phone of a neighbor she barely knew, asking if anyone had seen her father. They thought getting rid of me meant getting rid of their problem. They forgot that I'd spent 38 years as a contracts attorney. Before we go any further, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me what time it is where you are right now. The first thing I noticed when I pulled into the driveway that Tuesday afternoon was how quiet everything was. I'd been up in Vermont for 9 days helping my old friend Russell settle his late wife's estate, sorting through 40 years of accumulated life in a farmhouse outside Montpelier. It was hard, slow work, and I'd driven back to Connecticut feeling hollowed out in the way grief work always leaves you, ready for nothing more demanding than my own armchair and a decent night's sleep. My toolbox was sitting at the end of the driveway, not the small one I kept in the garage, the large red Craftsman chest I'd owned since 1987, the one I'd wheeled into every house I'd ever lived in, the one that had my initials scratched into the side panel from when my youngest grandson had gotten hold of a screwdriver 2 summers ago. It was sitting on the concrete apron between the mailbox and the street, lid open, tools scattered around it like someone had gone through it in a hurry and stopped caring halfway through. I sat in the car with the engine running for a long moment. Behind the toolbox were boxes, cardboard moving boxes, some sealed with tape, others just folded shut, a few split open at the seams where they'd been overfilled and dragged rather than carried. I could see the edge of my winter coat hanging out of one. The handle of my old fishing rod was sticking out of another at an angle that told me it hadn't been packed so much as shoved. I turned off the engine. The afternoon was cool for late September, that particular Connecticut autumn cold that feels like a warning rather than a season. I walked to the nearest box and opened the flap. Inside, wrapped in a dish towel I recognized from my own kitchen back in Harrisburg, was the small cedar box where I kept the few things I had left of my wife Margaret. Her reading glasses, a birthday card she'd written me the year before the diagnosis, the bracelet she wore every single day for the last decade of her life. Someone had packed up Margaret's cedar box in a dish towel and put it in a cardboard box on the driveway. I stood there with my hands on the flap and didn't move for what felt like a long time. The neighborhood around me continued on as if nothing unusual was happening. A woman walked a golden retriever past the end of the driveway and didn't look over. A car slowed at the stop sign on the corner and pulled away. The only sign that anything was wrong from the outside was one old man standing next to a pile of his belongings, wondering how the afternoon had turned into this. What happened here? The question formed clearly in my mind, but I already knew the shape of the answer. I just didn't have the details yet. I walked to the front door and tried my key. It went in, turned part way, and stopped. I tried again, slower, and the key refused to catch on anything. The lock was different. The lock had been changed while I was in Vermont helping a grieving friend sort through his dead wife's belongings. I rang the doorbell. Nothing. I knocked. Still nothing. I could hear the television on inside, the particular sound of the afternoon news my daughter watched every day at 4 o'clock without fail. So someone was home. Someone was just choosing not to come to the door. I walked around to the side gate and found it latched from the inside in a way I couldn't reach through the slats. I went back to the driveway and called my daughter's cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again, same result. I tried my son-in-law Theodore's number, which he never answered on a good day, and was unsurprised when it went directly to voicemail without ringing at all. I sat down on the toolbox. Across the street, I could see movement behind the curtains in my neighbor Patrice's living room window. Patrice had lived in that house for 16 years, and had watched me plant the rose bushes along my daughter's front walk and build the pergola in the backyard, and put new gutters up last spring when Theodore kept saying he'd get to it. Patrice knew me. Patrice was watching through her curtains and not coming out. That told me something about how much groundwork had been laid before I got home. I went across the street anyway and knocked. The curtains stilled. After a pause, the door opened 4 inches on a chain. "Patrice," I said, "I just got back from Vermont, and my things are on the driveway and the locks are changed. Do you know what's going on?" She looked at me with the expression of someone who is sorry but has already decided not to get involved. I heard them moving things around yesterday evening, she said. I assumed it was some kind of spring cleaning situation. She paused. I'm sorry, Ray. I really am. I hope you get it sorted out. The door closed. Ray, my daughter's name for me. My son-in-law had never called me anything but Raymond, always with the faint formality of someone reminding you that you're a guest in their lives. After 11 years, I went back across the street and started going through the boxes methodically, the way I used to approach a pile of documents in Discovery, not looking for anything in particular, just building a complete picture. Margaret's cedar box went into the front seat of my car immediately, wrapped back in the dish towel. My legal files, which I kept in a fireproof accordion folder, were in the third box I opened, mercifully intact. My laptop was there too, which told me whoever packed these boxes was either too rushed or too careless to realize what they were throwing away in terms of information. Margaret's bracelet had a small clasp that had always been slightly loose. She'd meant to get it fixed and never did, and I'd kept meaning to get it fixed after she was gone and hadn't done that either. It was still on the bracelet. I checked it twice and put it in my shirt pocket. The boxes told a story, not a complicated one, but a specific one. Everything had been packed in a single day, probably in a single long session, by someone who was motivated more by urgency than by care. Things that should have stayed together had been separated. Things that should have been protected had been thrown loose. This was not the work of someone tidying up a situation. This was the work of someone trying to finish before they lost their nerve. At 5:15, a car pulled into the driveway. My daughter April got out of the passenger side. Theodore came around from the driver's side. They'd been somewhere together, probably coordinating whatever came next, and they'd timed their return for the early evening rather than the middle of the day, which told me they'd hoped I might simply have taken the hint and left. April, I said. I kept my voice very even. I just got home from Vermont. Can someone explain what's happening here? She didn't meet my eyes. She was 39 years old and had her mother's coloring and had been crying recently, which I could tell from the set of her jaw. She'd always cried when she was preparing to say something she knew was wrong. Theodore answered for her. He was always the one who answered. He had the kind of steady, managerial voice that was good in boardrooms intended to produce compliance from people who didn't pay close attention. We've been talking about this for a while, he said. The house is ours now, Raymond. We don't need you here anymore. He said, the house is ours now, the way you state a fact that's been established and is no longer worth discussing. The mortgage was paid off 4 months ago, he said. We appreciate everything you contributed, but this arrangement has run its course. I looked at my daughter. April, what is he talking about? She finally looked at me. Her expression was something I hadn't seen on her face since she was a teenager. That particular combination of guilt and defiance that people wear when they've made a decision they can't fully justify and have decided to commit to it anyway rather than face the alternative. Dad, she said, we just need our space. You understand. I looked at the boxes stacked around us. I looked at the Craftsman toolbox with my tools scattered around it. I looked at the living room window where the curtains were slightly open, which meant my grandchildren were probably watching from somewhere inside, and I made a decision not to make this ugly in front of them. You want me to leave, I said. Theodore nodded with the expression of a man who has rehearsed this moment and is executing his plan. Tonight, he said, I think it's cleaner that way. I picked up the accordion folder with my legal documents and walked to my car. I heard April say something behind me, a half-formed protest she didn't finish. I heard Theodore say her name once, quietly, the way you'd say the name of someone you're keeping in line. I didn't turn around. I drove to the Residence Inn on Route 44, which I'd stayed at once before during a kitchen renovation, and which I remembered as clean, quiet, and staffed by people who asked very few personal questions. The woman at the desk gave me a room on the second floor overlooking the parking lot, handed me a key card, and wished me a pleasant stay with the practiced warmth of someone who had absolutely no idea what kind of evening I was having. That was fine. I didn't need her to know. The room was generic and blameless. 2 beds, a small desk, a television I didn't turn on. I set Margaret's cedar box on the nightstand and the accordion folder on the desk and sat on the edge of the bed for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting the day settle around me. After a while I started thinking. 11 years. April and Theodore had gotten married when she was 28, a big wedding at a vineyard in Napa that I'd helped pay for, and they'd bought this house in Fairfield County 2 years later when it became clear Theodore's banking clear was going to keep them in Connecticut. The house was more than they could comfortably afford, which in 2013 was a common situation, and I'd come in as co-borrower because April's credit history had some old problems from her mid-20s, and Theodore's income alone wasn't quite enough for the loan they needed. I'd been retired by then, collecting pension from my 38 years at the firm and Social Security, and living very comfortably on significantly less than I'd earned at my peak. When April called me about the mortgage situation, I hadn't hesitated. Margaret had been gone 3 years. The house in Harrisburg felt like it was mostly just keeping me company out of habit, and here was a chance to actually be useful to my daughter and be closer to my grandchildren. I moved into the guest room in February of 2014. The first few years had been good in the way that first years often are, when everyone is trying and the goodwill is still fresh. I babysat, I cooked, I handled the repairs that Theodore never quite got around to. I drove April to her medical appointments the year she had the back surgery. I took the grandchildren to school on the mornings that work consumed both of their schedules, which became increasingly frequent. Somewhere around year 6, I started noticing the temperature dropping. Not in an obvious way. Nobody sat me down and told me things had changed. It was more like the way a season changes in New England, so gradually that you don't notice until one day you're wearing a coat and can't quite remember the last time you weren't. Theodore's responses to my presence at the dinner table went from engaged to polite to perfunctory. April started having her phone calls in her bedroom with the door closed. I'd hear them talking in the kitchen after I'd said goodnight, and the conversations would stop when I came back for a glass of water. I told myself it was stress. Theodore's division had been restructured twice. The kids had hit the ages where parenting gets complicated. Everyone was tired. I made myself smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. I stopped offering opinions on household decisions I hadn't been asked about. I ate dinner at whatever time was convenient rather than asking them to coordinate around me. The closer we got to the end of the mortgage, I understood now, the less they needed the arrangement to work. I sat in that hotel room and thought about the timeline with the clarity that distance and betrayal provide. The mortgage had 4 years left when the pandemic hit. Theodore's bonus that year had been substantial. They'd refinanced into a shorter term, which I hadn't been informed about, and sometime in the spring of this year they'd made the final payment. 4 months ago, by Theodore's own accounting. 4 months of knowing the arrangement was over before they said a word to me. I opened the accordion folder and went through the documents the way I used to approach any contract I was asked to review, looking for what was actually there rather than what someone wanted me to believe was there. The original loan documents, the deed, the property tax records I'd accumulated over 11 years because I'm a lawyer, and lawyers keep records even when they're retired and living in their daughter's guest room and trying not to be a burden. I read every page carefully. Then I read them again. I wasn't a co-borrower on the loan. I was a co-owner on the deed. When the loan officer had walked us through the paperwork in 2013, I'd been the one with the legal background, and I'd been the one who noticed that the way the deed was structured in order to protect the lender in the event of default required that both co-borrowers be listed as co-owners on the property title. I'd flagged it, reviewed it, and signed it knowing exactly what it meant. Apparently no one else at that table had paid the same attention, or they'd assumed it wouldn't matter, or they'd simply forgotten over the course of 11 years. I owned 40% of a house in Fairfield County. Not the mortgage, not the loan, which was Theodore and April's name. The deed, the actual legal title to the property itself. My name was on it as clearly as it had been the day I signed. I closed the folder and sat quietly for a moment. Then I called my former colleague, James Whitfield, who'd taken over my practice area when I retired, and who owed me approximately 9 professional favors going back to the 1990s. I apologized for calling late on a Tuesday evening. He said, "Don't worry about it. What do you need?" I explained the situation in the precise, unemotional language of someone describing a legal matter rather than a family one. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Ray," he said, "do you understand what you're holding?" "I do," I said. "As a co-owner on the deed," James explained, "I had the legal right to force a partition sale. In Connecticut, when co-owners of a property cannot agree on its disposition, any co-owner can petition the court to order a sale and divide the proceeds according to ownership percentage. Theodore and April couldn't sell the house, refinance it, or do anything significant with the title without my signature. They couldn't force me off the deed without my consent. They couldn't buy me out without negotiating with me, and they most certainly couldn't evict me, because you cannot evict someone who has legal ownership interest in a property. What they could do, James said with a dry humor I appreciated, was change the locks on someone who had every legal right to walk through those doors whenever he pleased. I thanked him, made an appointment for Thursday morning, and went to sleep with more peace than I'd felt in 6 years. Wednesday I spent at a legal supply store, a notary office, and a commercial real estate attorney's office that James had recommended for the property valuation work. By Thursday afternoon I had a formal appraisal initiated, a partition petition drafted, and a very clear picture of what a Fairfield County property of that size and location was currently worth on the market. The number was just over $840,000. 40% of $840,000. I drove to Vermont that Thursday evening, not because I needed to. Russell's estate work was finished. I went because I wanted to be somewhere Theodore and April would have to work to find me, and because I wanted space to think without the pull of proximity making me soft. Russell had a spare room and a wood stove, and asked very few questions, which was exactly the company I needed. I turned my phone off before I crossed the state line. It was off for 6 days. When I turned it back on outside of Montpelier on a quiet Sunday morning, the notifications took almost 2 full minutes to load. 63 missed calls, 31 voicemails. Text from April's number that started demanding and became increasingly incoherent as the days passed. A voicemail from Theodore that was the most revealing thing he'd ever said to me in 11 years of living under the same roof, his voice losing all of its boardroom steadiness, cracking in places he clearly hadn't intended. Raymond, the voicemail said, "We've spoken with an attorney. We understand the situation with the deed. I want you to know we never intended. I want you to know that what happened last week was—" He paused for a long time. "Please call us back. We need to talk about this. We never intended." I replayed that sentence twice. They hadn't intended what, exactly? They hadn't intended for me to know. They hadn't intended for the document to say what it said. They hadn't intended for an attorney's son to be the person they tried to push out of a house he legally owned. I listened to all 31 voicemails in order, sitting in my car outside a gas station while the morning traffic on Route 2 moved past. The progression was remarkable in its clarity. The first voicemails were angry, demanding, full of the language of people who expect compliance. The middle ones shifted into confusion as they realized I wasn't available and wasn't becoming available. The later ones, from days 4 and 5, had the particular quality of people who have discovered that a situation they thought they controlled is not, in fact, under their control. April's last voicemail was just her saying, "Dad, please just call me. I need to know you're okay." I believe the last part was genuine. I believe she did want to know I was okay. I also believed that wanting to know I was okay was not the same as having treated me like I was okay when it would have cost her something to do so. I called James from the gas station parking lot. "How are we looking?" I asked. He told me the partition petition was ready to file. The appraisal had come back at $852,000. He'd also had a preliminary conversation with a buyer's agent in Fairfield County who had a client specifically looking for move-in ready properties in that zip code. I told him to file. I drove back to Connecticut on Monday, not to the house, to the Residence Inn, same room, same parking lot view. I called April from the room and told her I was back and that I had received her messages. She started crying almost immediately. "Dad," she said, "we need to talk about the deed." "I know, we know. We didn't realize." "April," I said, "what did you think was going to happen when you put my belongings on the driveway?" She couldn't answer that. She tried twice and stopped both times. "I have a meeting with James Whitfield on Wednesday," I told her. "You and Theodore should have your attorney there. We'll discuss the options." I hung up and sat quietly for a while. Through the window I could see the parking lot, and beyond it a strip mall with a pharmacy and a dry cleaner and a nail salon. All the ordinary commerce of ordinary life continuing without reference to what was happening in my hotel room or in the house 11 minutes away where my daughter was probably sitting at the kitchen table with Theodore trying to calculate the cost of what they'd done. Wednesday's meeting was professional and brief. James presented the petition and the appraisal. Their attorney, a younger man who clearly wished he was somewhere else, explained that his clients understood the legal situation and wanted to discuss alternatives to a forced sale. Theodore looked like someone who had not slept well in 10 days. April looked like someone who had cried in the car on the way here and done her best to cover the evidence. They sat side by side across the conference table from me and James, and for the first time in 11 years, Theodore didn't look like someone executing a plan. "What are the options?" Theodore asked, his voice careful and controlled, and about 30% less certain than usual. James explained them cleanly. "I could proceed with the partition petition, in which case the court would order the property sold and the proceeds divided according to the deed. I could agree to a buyout of my 40% interest, for which we already had a market value, less any negotiated adjustments, or we could reach a private agreement of some kind, though James noted that, given recent events, I was under no obligation to consider any arrangement that didn't fully compensate my legal interest." April looked at me across the table. "Dad," she said. She stopped. I waited. "If we had to sell," she said finally, "where would you go?" It was such a strange question given the circumstances that I almost didn't answer it. April. I've been living in a hotel room for 10 days. I managed to organize a property appraisal, file a legal petition, and drive to Vermont and back. I think I'm capable of figuring out where to live. Theodore cleared his throat. "We'd like to explore the buyout option," he said. "We'd need to refinance to access the equity." James and their attorney began discussing the mechanics. I looked at the window and thought about Margaret, who had been a high school English teacher and who had always been better than me at reading people's actual intentions underneath what they presented. She'd liked April enormously and had been cautiously reserved about Theodore from the beginning, which I'd attributed to the territorial instincts of a mother, and which I now understood had been accurate observation. The buyout agreement took 3 weeks to finalize. Theodore and April refinanced the house to access the equity, which meant taking on new debt on a property they'd been thrilled to own free and clear, which had a certain symmetry I appreciated without saying so. My 40% came to $338,000, minus legal fees and adjustments, which settled at just over $320,000. The check cleared on a Friday afternoon in November. I'd already been in contact with a real estate agent in Asheville, North Carolina, where I'd spent a summer in my 30s, and always meant to go back to. The mountains in late fall looked in photographs exactly as I remembered them from memory, which doesn't always happen. I found a small house with a workshop space in the back, which was the thing I'd missed most acutely during 11 years of being a guest in someone else's home. Space to work with my hands without apologizing for the noise. I drove south on a Saturday. The Craftsman toolbox was loaded in the truck bed with moving blankets around it. Margaret's cedar box was on the passenger seat. The accordion folder was in the back with a rubber band around it that I'd replace with a proper filing system once I had a desk to organize things on. Somewhere around the Virginia border, with the Blue Ridge beginning to appear at the edge of the horizon, I turned my phone on for the first time in 3 days. There were 7 missed calls from April, 2 from Theodore, which was unusual enough that I noted it. A text from April that read, "I know you don't owe us anything. I just want you to know I understand now what we did. I don't expect you to forgive us, but I want you to know I'm sorry. I think I've been letting Theodore make decisions I should have been making myself for a long time." I read it twice, then I drove another 40 miles before I answered, because some things deserve more than a pulled over on the highway response. When I stopped for gas in Roanoke, I typed back, "I received your message. I'm going to need some time. I hope the kids are well." I didn't say I forgave her. I didn't say I didn't. That was honest, which I thought was more than the last several years had been. The Asheville house smelled like old wood and cedar, which felt appropriate. The workshop in the back had good light and the concrete floor and outlets on 3 walls, which was more than I needed but exactly what I wanted. I spent the first evening unloading the truck and arranging the toolbox against the wall where it would be most useful, and putting Margaret's cedar box on the windowsill in the bedroom where the morning light would hit it. I didn't call anyone that night. I made dinner, sat on the back porch in a folding chair, and listened to the mountains being quiet. People ask sometimes how you rebuild a life when the people you trusted with it make you understand they never deserved that trust. The honest answer is that you do it the same way you built it the first time. One decision at a time, starting with the decision about what matters and what doesn't. My tools mattered. Margaret's bracelet mattered. The morning light mattered. The rest was paperwork, and I'd always been very good at paperwork. I've had a lot of time to think, driving south through Virginia, with the mountains starting to show themselves at the edge of everything. That's what long drives do. They strip away the noise and leave you with whatever's actually true. What's true is this: Theodore and April didn't become who they showed me that Tuesday afternoon suddenly. People don't. The cruelty of what they did, stacking Margaret's cedar box in a cardboard box on the driveway like it was something to be disposed of. That didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of small decisions, small surrenders of decency, each one making the next one easier. I'd watched it happen and kept finding reasons to look away. That's on me, not the betrayal, but the looking away. Here's what I've come to understand about consequences. They're not punishment handed down from somewhere outside the situation. They're just the situation continuing to its natural end. Theodore and April made a calculation. They decided I was a resource that had been fully used and could now be discarded. What they failed to account for was that I'd spent 38 years reading contracts and understanding exactly what the words meant. Their calculation was based on a version of me they'd invented, the quiet, grateful old man who ate dinner alone and asked for nothing. They forgot, or maybe never knew, that the quiet old man had also been the one who reviewed every page of the deed before he signed it. Intelligence isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about knowing what you're holding and being patient enough to wait for the right moment to use it. I didn't call James Whitfield in a panic. I didn't confront Theodore in the driveway in front of my grandchildren. I went to a hotel room, opened a folder, read every document carefully, and then made one measured phone call to someone who knew what to do. That's not cleverness. That's just the habit of thinking before acting, which I'd spent a lifetime trying to practice and which turned out to matter more than anything else in those 10 days. And the resilience part. I don't think resilience is something you perform. I think it's what you find out you have when the thing you were leaning on disappears. I thought I was living in my daughter's house. I was actually living in my own house, and I'd spent years making myself small in it. When they put my tools on the driveway, they handed me back something I hadn't realized I'd given away, the knowledge that I didn't need their permission to exist. April's last text said she understood now what they'd done. I believe her. I also know that understanding something and having paid for it are different things, and the understanding came only because the cost became real. That's not a comfortable truth, but it's an honest one. People extend grace when grace is easy. The harder thing, and the thing I'm still working out as I drive toward a house in Asheville I've never slept in, is what to do with grace when it wasn't easy. When it cost you something, when you're sitting with Margaret's bracelet in your shirt pocket trying to decide what kind of person you want to be for whatever time you have left. I don't have a clean answer to that yet, but I think that's probably what the mountains are for.